I'd like to introduce our speaker, Will Addison. Probably most of you know him already. He's been here with his lovely wife, Virginia, for since 1978, and during that time he's made a lot of friends with World War II veterans, and through his friendship with them has developed a really good understanding of military aviation. He is the co-author of this wonderful book on West Point that most of you probably have seen by Arcadia Publishing. We have it for sale in the museum. And he's also authored an article titled Port Richmond Days. Where did that publication, what's the publication of that?
It was private.
Oh, okay.
And it was done really for the Tokars family, for their family reunion.
Oh, okay.
And then I made sure that the Historical Society got a copy of it for their archives.
Super.
So I think it's on the website, I think.
Good, great. So this is Will Addison. Please welcome him.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much I want to thank Carol and also the Board of Directors for the Historical Society for affording this opportunity for me to be here today, and I want to thank you wholeheartedly for your interest in also being here. One thing that, as Carol mentioned, when I co-authored with Kathy Hoganson the book on history of West Point, it became obvious that if you were to construct a timeline of historical events for the American history, you could do a corollary for West Point, and you would find that the points all match up. So in other words, West Point is somewhat singularly unique, maybe not the only town in the country that has this attribute, but certainly one of the few, that if you study the history of West Point, you're studying the history of America in a microcosm. When Dr. Hosfield approached me a couple weeks ago and asked me if I'd be willing to do a little talk on aviation, I said I'd be happy to do that. I think I can cobble together enough material that would be interesting. And that fact is that aviation is no exception to that. That if you were to study aviation, the history of such in the United States, that there are corollaries that all translate here in the town of West Point as well. So for a moment, let me just take you back to 1862. It's May. The Confederacy is abandoning its positions in Williamsburg, having just endeavored to do a holding action at Fort Magruder. And now the Confederate Army is on the march heading through James City County towards New Kent in an effort to get to the outer defenses of Richmond to protect their capital. This is a critical move for them, and it's a critical move for the Union forces who are in pursuit. And General McClellan is very interested in trying to stop this because he could actually precipitate a very early end to the war if he was successful in doing this. So he ordered his General Franklin to cobble together a makeshift fleet of vessels made up of steamers and schooners and barges that were decked over and made into barges, and escorted by Union gunboats and warships, they sailed up the York River, where they would make a landing at what is known today as Eltham's Landing near Brick House. To assist in that, a gentleman by the name of Thaddeus Lowe, who was instrumental in establishing the lighter-than-air division, the balloon corps, if you will, of the Union Army, had at his disposal half a dozen balloons. And he had a means to launch them insofar as the Union forces had captured or taken for their own use a barge, a former coal barge, decked it over and basically converted it into a landing station from which they could send aloft these balloons. Now these balloons were not hot air balloons, they were in fact hydrogen. And the interesting thing about the hydrogen is that the gas was created by a chemical reaction by taking a cylinder, sealed cylinder, which you'd fill with iron filings and pour hydrochloric acid on it. The resulting chemical reaction created hydrogen gas from which they could then fill the balloons. And this was done in a very portable fashion, carried around by wagons and then put onto this floating aircraft carrier, if you will, which would be the first one that would be in the United States existence. And the interesting thing about the vessel itself was that its name was George Washington Parke Custis, and there's no irony, there's a little irony in that, insofar as the name represents his namesake, is the father-in-law of none other than the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee. So here's a Union ship named after the father-in-law of the commanding general of the opposing sides, and it's launching this air balloon up into the atmosphere. It was pulled in tow by a tugboat up the York River. Unfortunately for the Union forces, the ground cover was so thick with the trees and underbrush that they were unable to discern any significant movements or embattlements or positions that would gain them any advantage at all. So essentially, when Franklin, with his fleet, came up to disembark at Brickhouse, he was met with a very warm welcome from the Confederacy. Had established artillery positions and also small arms fire, to the extent that the Union forces were basically forced to dig in immediately upon landing. And they stayed in that position for a day, to the point that General Franklin self-congratulated himself. He sent a note to his commanding General McClellan saying, "I congratulate myself that we have managed to maintain our position," which the alternative would have been being forced back into the water. The long and short of it was that they were unsuccessful in doing what McClellan wanted to do. They did not stop the Confederate movement of troops. In fact, they lost more troops than the South did in the endeavor. The Confederacy also had two balloons, and they were popularly called at the time the silk dress balloons, under the summarization that these balloons were provided by the silks of the dresses of the Southern belles. Further research indicates that this, in fact, is not true, that it was actually new silk material that was used, but the name stuck because of the romantic idea. Both Confederate balloons saw very short use, and they unfortunately were captured and fell into Union hands very shortly after their initial activities. Balloons would continue to be used for several years until the middle of the Civil War, when they were really not appreciated and unable to really come up with any really good results. Balloons would continue to be an activity in the Army Air Forces up until the early part of World War II, but they would be taken over by another development, that being heavier than air aircraft. A gentleman by the name of Otto Lilienthal, who was a German who never came to this country, but he did have a patent in the United States in 1894, was instrumental in designing brilliant heavier than air aircraft, which today, if you were to look at them, you would think that they were basically hang gliders. But he also developed designs that ran out of time for both monoplanes, biplanes, and he even came up with a steam power plant for one of them. Between 1891 and 1896, he flew over 2,000 flights. And on one of his flights, his last flight, in fact, he was about 50-foot elevation. He lost control of his craft and fell 50 feet and broke his neck. Notwithstanding, though, that his designs provided an inspiration for two American brothers across the Atlantic, none other than Orville and Wilbur Wright, who by 1903 took some of his designs and were able to build the 1903 Wright Flyer, which flew successfully at Kitty Hawk. From that point, aviation excelled at a breakneck speed, such that by August of 1914, with the opening gunfire of the First World War, all the principal powers of Great Britain, Germany, France, and the United States would come in 1917, were able to put into the air aircraft that were capable to reach speeds and elevation and payloads that were far exceeding the imagination of anybody from 10 or 20 years before. To the extent that by the end of the war, when the armistice was signed, it was a proven point that aviation was here to stay, both military and civilian. So back in the United States, the Army Air Corps, as it was called still, determined that they wanted to have basically established air routes that would be critical for defense and communications. And one of those, of course, was going to be from Newport News to Washington, D.C. And in the course of events, they wanted to have established intermediate points where, in case a plane ran into trouble or needed fuel, it could land and stop safely and be resupplied or repaired. Well, West Point happened to be one of those places. The mayor and the founder, a visionary in his own right, Crosby Thompson, decided that it would be a good idea to have an airfield established in Port Richmond. And he was able to get hold of the property on the old Lee estate. It was over 1,000 acres. That property exists today in the family of Ellis and Dudley Olson. They built, he had cleared two 3,000-foot runways. There was a hangar, a repair facility, and fuel. By 1929, it was lighted for actual use at night. And that little field, which originally was called Thompson Field, and later, once the Army Air Corps got involved, it became known as Lee Field. It was dedicated. You'll see in the book here, and then I brought a copy of the cover that has the dedication on October 11 and 12 in 1928. Had a special cancellation on it. It was a big deal. This particular airfield, other than Langley or Byrd, had more flights in and out than any other field in Virginia. In 1929 alone, it had over 1,500 military flights coming in and out, including bombers, multi-engine, and single pursuit aircraft. There's a number of pictures that were taken, which I invite anyone to look at afterwards, and got pictures of some of the planes landing. In between the military exhibitions that took place here, there were civilians that would come in with barnstorming events and different types of activities, such that if a young fellow wanted to take for $8 a ride in the front cockpit, the observation seat, or the biplane, he could do that. One such individual's name was Clemmy Tokars. He was one of the 6 Tokars brothers who lived in Port Richmond, which incidentally, the Tokars family had 6 brothers. All 6 went into the military. The youngest one, Tommy, he was too young. He couldn't get in World War II, so he was in Korea. But the other 5 were all in World War II, and every single one of them came back. Well, Clemmy, I think, was one of the oldest. In any case, he was so inspired by his ability to go up and see the ground from above that he would join the Army Air Corps. By 1938, he had his wings. When Pearl Harbor hit, he was already there. He flew throughout the war. He eventually retired as a full colonel in the Army Air Force, all because of that one day where he saw that plane and got a chance to fly in it. How many other young people had that same opportunity, and similar events transpired? A bit of tragedy on that particular day, though. After the pilot had finished his long day of taking people up in the air, on his departure and takeoff from Port Richmond to go back to Richmond, he banked too steeply and he drilled himself into the ground and was killed. The broken propeller, I believe, if it's not the same one, it's one very similar to it, hung on the wall in the old Port Richmond store known as Robin's Store for many a year. That building has now been torn down, and the propeller now rests in the hands of a private collector. In 1932, they actually opened a training school, the Army Air Corps did, at Lee Field. But by 1937, because of the increasing size and speed of aircraft, the field was now obsolete. After Pearl Harbor, in 1943 of July, the field that is now where we're at today was established, and as of today, it still has military landing rights. It was basically an auxiliary field, a scrambler field, and a training field, and it fell under the jurisdiction of the 1st Air Force and the Army Air Force Training Command. And these 3 runways that you see are very typical of the type of runways that were built around the country for this type of activity, capable of supporting the heaviest bombers, the B-24s, the B-17s, as well as your pursuit aircraft. One of the activities that took place here, and this is not anything that's in any history book anywhere, this was just strictly because Robert and I had the hardware store here in town for many years, and veterans would come in frequently and tell stories, and this is one of those stories, so I think it's kind of fun to tell. There was an older gentleman, too old to serve in the military, who was an air raid warden. And what would happen at the field here is that they would have these planes pulling these tow targets, and then you sent up the pursuit planes to come up and they would shoot at the targets. It was a dangerous enterprise. A lot of your WASPs did that kind of duty, and it wouldn't be too far from reality that a stray bullet could hit the towing plane. But in any case, it wasn't unusual for these banners of silk to be cut loose by the bullets, and this big fluttering piece of silk would come down to the ground and get tangled up in a tree somewhere. Well, that was a lot of inventory, and the Army Air Force wanted it back. So some of the more intrepid youths who would watch this with fascination of this enterprise going on in the air would climb up these trees and rescue this silk and bring it down to the ground, only to be met by this air raid warden saying, "Give it to me, it's government property," and then he'd take it and get the reward.
I was one of those.
Wait,
So
the
Not the
kid in the
warden.
tree or the one taking it? Oh.
I would go in the woods and collect them.
So you were one of the kids. Do you know the man I'm talking about?
No?
Oh, because I don't know I can't remember his name, so it's a good thing. So,
I'll tell you a few more things about those targets, though.
Right.
But go ahead.
Okay.
I didn't want to interrupt.
Okay. One thing about Langley, this of course was an auxiliary field for Langley and also Quantico and Byrd Field. Langley was really instrumental in defense of the East Coast against anti-submarines. They were developing all kinds of technology for that, so that's significant in its own right. And even though probably no great events happened in this airport itself, the fact that it was there and provided support for Langley, which was the larger field, is significant in its own right. As a kind of a final aside, there was a gentleman who was also in the Air Force, Dr. O.A. Bristow, who was a dentist here in town. He was in the Air Force Reserve. His brother was a pilot, I believe, in World War II. And at some point, somebody here might know the exact year. I don't know that. But again, this is just a story that we heard at the hardware store, that somebody flew in, I believe it was him, a B-24 to this field and just landed it here. And here it sat for years and years, suffered from gunshots from local hunters who took target practice on it, till the poor plane just sat there and the wing sagged. Eventually, it was sold for scrap or salvage to the Confederate Air Force for parts, and then it disappeared from that point. But that kind of ends the era of World War II as far as the field goes. As I mentioned before, this field still has military landing rights. Now, you might think that that's the end of all the aviation, but there's one other story that I'd like to tell that I think is fascinating. It's bizarre in its own right, and there's very little written about it. But some years ago at a crab carnival, there was an opportunity for folks to ride on a boat and go up the river on a cruise. Was that 15 years ago, 20 years ago? It's been quite a while ago. And the young lady who was the speaker, or tour guide, if you will, spoke of a program that was taking place up at the old World War I shipyard where the two Liberty ships were built. Only one was launched and the other one stayed there on the ways. It was still there in World War II, rotting in the dry dock. In any case, she said there was a secret program going on there that had something to do with icebergs and sawdust, and she really didn't know a whole lot about it, but there was something that was going on there. And then, when I was selling cars for Mac Medlin between 1997 and 2001, one day an elderly gentleman came in the car dealership. How he happened to find me, I do not know, but somebody sent him to me. And he sat down at my desk and proceeded to tell me a story that during World War II, he was a young private stationed here in West Point, and he was at this facility. And they were doing some kind of secret work there at the old shipyard, trying to come up with a way to create icebergs that could float across the Atlantic and provide landing stations for large planes. Well, I did some more research on it. Doggone it, come to find out, there was a guy by the name of Jeffrey Pike. He was an Englishman in the Secret Service, basically, and military in Great Britain, who came up with the idea. He convinced Lord Mountbatten of it, and Lord Mountbatten sent him to the United States with the idea of coming up and down the East Coast and finding a facility where you could do this. Well, one of the things he needed in order to infuse the ice and make it stronger was sawdust. And if West Point had a profusion of anything at that time, it was sawdust. And it certainly had access to the Chesapeake Bay, being vis-a-vis the York River. So whether or not that's what happened here, I think there's 3 dots, and if you connect the dots, it says it's possible. And I can find very little else about it, except to say that the U.S. Navy was interested enough that previous to World War II, they did gunnery practice on icebergs just to see what the impact of artillery shells would be. And they found out that icebergs were basically unsinkable, that they'd actually absorb the shells, and sometimes the shells wouldn't even explode. So that if you take the technology here and you infuse ice, it's a whole lot cheaper than steel. I think what happened, though, is that it never came to fruition. Like many, probably hundreds of different secret programs that took place throughout World War II, all with the same goal of ending the war as soon as possible. A lot of them never came to fruition. I think this was probably one of them. Because with our technology, with the massive carpet bombardment of Germany and then later of Japan, I think the war ended before it was ever necessary. So it becomes an interesting afterthought and something of mystery and conjecture. Finally, we've talked about places and we've talked about events, but we haven't talked about the people. And to me, the people are the most important part. And I wish he was here today. I invited him, but he didn't make it. John W. Harper was an air gunner in the 8th Air Force in a B-24 Liberator. And he wrote a really interesting book, and some of you may have seen it. But his remarkable story is that he was in a unit that B-24s, they were flying over the sub-pens at Kyle, and they were hit by an 88 anti-aircraft gun, such that the plane couldn't make it back. They were going to try and get to Sweden, but they just couldn't make it. The plane was too shot up. So they got the orders to ditch, and they bailed out. Most of them made it to the ground successfully, but they were all captured. And he ended up in a Luftstalag. And then towards the end of the war, with the German front collapsing in front of the Russian advance, the few German soldiers that were charged with their care, if you will call it care, their internment, put them on a 600-mile forced march of starvation and disease. That luckily, after about 30 days of marching like that, they ended up being rescued by Patton's Third Army. But what a remarkable man, and he is just one of dozens and dozens of men and women who served in the military just from West Point, King and Queen, New Kent, the surrounding area. There's an amazing number of people that served in the Army, Air Force, the Airborne, the submarines, the PT boats, you name it, they did it. The WACs, the Waves, the Spars, and then you take another example, Gray Dunlap. She was a WASP. She's passed away, but her husband still lives up in King William. And the neat thing about that is that there was only 1,200 of these gals. There was 3,000 that applied, but it was so rigorous that 2/3 of them washed out. She was one that made it, and she flew. And then the program ended about 8 months after she got her wings. And so she ended up being a flight instructor. And one of her first students would be her husband, who learned to fly under her direction, and ended up being a pilot in Korea. And then he flew for 25 years with American Airlines. So there's just so many interesting stories. And then there's the guy Stanley Rizak. He was one of the flight commanders in the 90th Bomb Group, Jolly Rogers. He lived right up here on King William Avenue. I believe he's since passed away as well. And he had a reunion. I was lucky to go to it probably 20 years ago, where he had all these guys come in from the squadron. And I was able to share in that. So with that, I want to thank everybody. If there's anyone here that served in that time period, I want to thank you. And I want to thank you again for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm happy to field them. I have a few things for you to look at up here. I have some original insignias. The squadron patches are not original, but they are accurate representations. And some of the flight gear there is all original as well. Yes, sir.
I had a couple of things.
Absolutely.
Best of my recollection, tell me where I'm wrong, but in the early 40s, I lived on 17th and Lee Street.
Okay.
And a couple showed up in a house trailer. They were going to build the airport and needed this place to live, so they parked that trailer beside our house while they built the airport. What word we got, and I'm not sure this is right, they were building it because the government had figured that if Langley or Norfolk or Washington were bombed and airplanes were in the air, they needed a place to go to.
Absolutely correct.
And that was the reason for this airport.
Yeah, absolutely correct. This was capable of taking that.
Right. And the people, I don't know why, it just came to me when I was coming over here. Hugh Corral was the name of the fella that lived beside us. We ran a cord from our house, electric cord, to his trailer. And
His lights.
they moved back to Portsmouth. Now, I'm not sure if that's where he was from to start with or not. But,
Well, that's interesting.
and let's see, go ahead a little. These targets you're talking about. The word I got was they would get a batch of targets into Norfolk, and for quality control, they would take one out of each pack to bring up and run around West Point behind the plane,
Okay.
just to test the structural integrity.
Okay.
And then they would, after they'd gone around a couple times, they would be over the airport, they could release one and send out the next one. And we schoolboys came over and would watch them drop, and if anything went in the woods, we were right after it.
There you go.
If it landed on the airport, they had a couple of servicemen on the ground to pick them up.
Right.
But these targets were great. My mother made curtains out of the material. I had a bathing suit made out of it. I had a Model A, and I got a black target. They were red, white, and black. And I took a black one and relined the inside of my Model A. So we made use of them. We also, in the early days, and I'm not sure what the early days were, but Fort Eustis did a lot of maneuvers here on the airport. And a couple of us kids would walk over from West Point and try to find things. And I found a gas mask, and I thought it was in heaven.
Oh, I bet. Yeah, all
But
kinds of gear.
let's see, what else? Well, in the late, I'm not sure when that was, but I'll say late 40s, there was a gentleman from Richmond, Cherry was his name, would come down on Sunday afternoons and take flights up, take you up, and some reason I would say maybe $8, $10 to go around the airport.
Sure.
And he would leave here and go over to Hartfield? Hartfield. And
Hullfield, maybe?
Pardon?
Hullfield over in Middlesex, maybe?
Yes. It's on the way to the bridge over there.
Yeah.
And he would leave here and go over there and do the same thing.
Was he flying like a Stearman or a AT-6 or was it a biplane or
Biplane.
Biplane? Yeah, probably a Stearman training plane. They were real popular for that. Very sturdy.
But that's some of the background that I remember.
That's great. Thank you.
But then just for the airport itself, in high school, and I was surprised when I drove up that there used to be another building over here, I think.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's been saved. It actually is at Brick House.
Oh, is that right? Anyway.
Or Brookshire, excuse me, Brookshire.
Jim Doman became the manager of this airport, and he was a band instructor at West Point, and mechanic, and ran the airport.
That reminds me of something. When they dedicated the airport at Lee Field, there was a band, a Port Richmond band, but they only knew one song, and that was Over There. So they played it over and over and over again.
Well, I appreciated Jim a lot because I started a little Dixieland group, and he would let us come over and use this building as a place to practice.
Sure.
And toward my senior year, 49, Bobby, 49?
51 is when we
Okay.
graduated.
Anyway, he let us, we put some lights out over the runway and set it on the porch of the building, and we played our music and had outside dance,
There you go.
night dance.
That's pretty neat.
We also did our driver's training over here. You remember
Well, that
doing
makes sense.
that?
You got lots of,
Yeah, I think
lots of space.
On the runways.
Principal Holman Humphreys in the late 50s would take us elementary school kids flying in his plane over here. So
Right.
That's
a
right.
lot
he
of
did
us
fly.
kids, that's the first time we ever been in an airplane.
Sure.
Uh-huh. Let's see. I can come up with other things, but nothing important.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. Yes, sir.
I haven't anything to confirm this, but when I was in high school, Mary Mowbray Branch, who taught history and French and social studies, I guess, she said that during the construction of the airport, when it was under construction, they took down a huge mound, which was in this flat land, it was a big hill.
Yeah.
It was an Indian burial ground.
Really? Here?
Yeah,
Wow.
and I don't know where it was located here,
Oh,
but
man.
I'm sure there were a lot of things in that when they took it down.
I wonder where all that went. Man.
Yeah, well, he'd be out there tomorrow digging.
I'm thinking it was down close to the water,
Sure.
so that was easy access to the,
Robert Curfeys, who's in the audience out here, is quite the local Indian expert. He probably able to offer some information on that, perhaps.
I'll tell you another thing, it might, at one time, when I was in high school, I guess, they used to have a 8-county fair, surrounding counties.
Yeah, I've heard about it.
And it was located here
Yep.
on the main runway this way. And so the, you know, they had a hard surface to put people to walk on. And
When do you think
everything.
that ended? When did that stop?
49, something like that.
That late? I mean, that long ago?
I've got a picture of 48 showing all the old.
So it didn't
And I
happen
think
in the 50s or 60s?
it probably stopped by 54 or something like that.
I mean, they were kind of a wild thing, from what I heard. Some wild things went on there.
Well, it had hoochie coochie.
That's what I mean. That's what I heard. Frank White used to tell us about that.
One thing might be, and just maybe everybody knows this, but you used to not be able to come in the way we do now.
Right.
It was a road off, it's Snow Hill, is that?
Snow Hill Road, yeah.
Yeah, okay. You used to have to go up to Snow Hill and come back in.
Okay. I wanted to mention too, before I leave, that I wanted to thank Bill Palmer for his cooperation and a lot of the information regarding the light and air aspect of the presentation. He was very helpful in that regard.
Let me ask you about those. I'm assuming they were just like we think of hot air balloons where people went up in them and they were supposed to shoot from them. Was that the purpose, or?
Not shoot, they were for observation.
Okay.
They would be tethered and they would not be free. A lot of your hot air balloons are free, and that's a different technology completely, because you've got a torch, if you will, that's making hot air that goes up into an open balloon. This was an actual closed balloon. Once you filled it with hydrogen, it was sealed up. And it was in a spherical shape as opposed to a cigar shape with that later technology of the Zeppelins, the Hindenburg and others like that, the Akron, the Macon, and so on, that the U.S. Navy and Army Air Force used. Those were sealed balloons.
Clarify my confusion. I'd always heard that the reinforcements from McClellan were at Plum Point. And you said, I think, Walker's
Brick House.
Brick House?
That's right close by.
How far apart? I'm not.
It's a pretty.
Adjacent.
Couple
I'm sorry.
miles, maybe.
It's adjacent.
Yeah.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah, Brick House Plantation is just across the road.
Okay, okay.
Lewis Briscoe had a B-24 here,
Okay, that's the one.
and it was supposed to be one he got from the invasion of Cuba when they tried to get it.
Oh,
And
okay,
he
so that would have
kept
been
it
about
here.
1963, 64 that he flew that in here, probably.
Right,
Okay.
right, and it was enclosed, instead of the glass front and all, it was all enclosed,
Okay.
and that's what he kept it.
So he bought that up as he bought that as surplus and just flew it in here and then never did anything with it?
I think I flew it once or twice, but
Really?
we all had to pitch in and pay for the oil.
I bet, I bet.
Because it burned so much.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I remember just climbing on it.
Yeah,
It was there, you climbed it.
yeah, sure.
I'll just add one name. You mentioned a lot of names. I'm sure there are a lot of people that from West Point involved, but one I remember is Nookie Brooks.
Yeah,
Was in the Battle of the Bulge.
yes, yes.
Where
Brooks,
Oh,
Ty's
Jimmy
dad,
Jones?
Ty's dad is another one.
I'm sorry.
Ty Bland was in the Battle of the
That's
Bulge.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Lost his leg.
That's right, yeah.
Uh-huh.
There's so many, you can't mention them all.
Any other questions or comments? Well, that was great. Thank you so much.